So, our overall impressions of the red wines today. Well, I mean, Junior, you were presiding over the whole thing. So, what did you reckon?
I think the number speaks for themselves. The number of the standards very, very high. Just looking at the number of, especially silver medal winning wines. So the overall standards in comparison to all the judging that we do together in London and elsewhere, it's very, very high. So,
And Freddie,
all positive.
you kind of, you know your Austrian red wines very well. What did you reckon?
Yeah, I think just to echo what Junior was saying, I think the quality is excellent. What's really, really exciting to see is just the potential for Zweigelt and Blaufränkisch, which we tasted a lot of today. They're two great varieties. They've got so much personality. In my opinion, the best examples are the ones where they get it right in the vineyard. There's not too much messing around with it in the winery. When winemakers are conscious of not over oaking and just allow those really interesting grape varieties to do the talking, they can be so good. So yeah, it's been really interesting.
The weather is so benign. There's so much sunshine. There's so much lovely, juicy fruit. And I agree with you. The thing is not to over oak. Let the lovely fruit expression just be by itself. In most cases.
Yeah, Kat, that was on our panel.
Yeah.
Quite a source of discussion, wasn't it?
It definitely was. So we tasted two separate flights of Zweigelt, and the really successful ones for us as sort of international judges were where the winemakers had allowed the fruit to do the talking. So they were really bright, very varietally pure, and there hadn't been much interference. We struggled a little bit more with, I guess, what you might call an international style, where the wines were quite heavily oaked. And certainly for our kind of UK palates, it just felt a little bit too much. And we really wanted to see the unique characters of those grape varieties coming through, because that's actually what's interesting for a consumer in the UK, is to try something that's very different they haven't seen before. So to let those unique characters and flavours come through rather than trying to kind of elevate with oak, which doesn't actually always do the job.
I think you can really tell when there's a sense of pride that the winemakers have in the local grape varieties. And I think that is reflected in, again, allowing those varieties to do the talking, but also, making a conscious decision to work with something which is unique to Austria is fantastic, and allow that to really, be the vehicle that puts Austrian red wines on the map. You can tell when the winemakers are passionate about those local grape varieties. Which is, I think, fantastic.
Megan, what about your panel?
Yeah, well, very much the same, to be honest, because we had two flights of Zweigelt as well. One which was more of the unoaked styles, one which was oaked. And the unoaked ones were so exciting for us. They were so pure, there was so much expression, there was so much going on. With some of the more oakier ones, that kind of masked those characters. So it was really exciting to have kind of like a deep dive into the grape variety and see all those subtle nuances and where the winemaking styles does make such a huge difference.
I love that beautiful brightness that Zweigelt has, that purity of fruit, that kind of bouncy crunchiness when it's unoaked, when you've got lovely fruit that hasn't been over yielded. It's incredibly charming, isn't it?
That's the thing, you're talking about yield. There's nothing wrong with oak sometimes, as long as there has enough fruit to support that. So if you're gonna put the wine in oak, then bring your yield down and don't over oak. Well, we're talking a lot about Zweigelt, but there's some, you tasted some, you had some beautiful Saint Laurent.
Yeah, the Saint Laurent, I think, was definitely the standout in our our flight. Unfortunately, we don't see enough of this in the UK. Only 500 hectares you were mentioning.
Just under 600, so 597 hectares, so it's quite low, but because it's difficult in the vineyard. But when one is done properly, again, with pride, good viticulture, and that beautiful purity of fruit, I think it can rival some really good Pinot.
Yeah, definitely some of the top Burgundian Pinot for sure. Very refined, complex, incredible wines.
You're a master sommelier, and it's Saint Laurent is just an amazing sommelier wine, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, agree.
Yeah, and we had some pretty good Blaufränkisch. I don't know if we're going to have any more tomorrow, but there were some good examples. Nothing that, to my mind, stood out like amazing, but some really good example, textbook with lovely freshness, good acidity, good structure, and
that's a grape that can have a really strong, clear identity, isn't it?
Yes.
Which is great to see, and having a strong, clear identity and sense of place as well is something which is so important when you're trying to put a new style on the global wine map. it's got to stand out.
Yes, exactly.
So the image of Austrian red wines in the UK, from your perspective at the Wine Society, what would you say is that image, Freddie?
It's a tough one because I think realistically within the UK market it's still relatively unknown. It's still been the white wines that have done most of the flag bearing for Austria in the UK. But I think that we are seeing a bit of traction being gained. People, I think, certainly from amongst the Wine Society membership, associate Austrian red wines with this freshness. Acidity is such a common conversation that we have when we're talking about Austrian wine in general, and that does and quite rightly should apply to the red wines as well. So the image I think that our customers have is that of a really perfect red wine, especially for the summer. Very food friendly. That acidity makes it very versatile when it comes to food pairing, and a lot of options for sticking in an ice bucket as well, which I think is really, really good. And that's a style that we're actually seeing gain traction across our membership, across the board, but something which Austria is particularly strong in.
Juicy, crunchy, fresh Zweigelt with a chill is just fabulous, isn't it?
Talking about red wine, the image of Austria in general is, to my mind, is always high standard, always at a high level. So that's overall image that I have. Then I agree. If you look at the figures, Austria, in most people's mind, is white. But at home, I love those really crunchy, light, unoaked styles, and I treated it. I put it in the fridge, and it's wonderful. But I think there's the image. I think we need to do more work to improve that also. But the quality of overall quality is there.
So the image of Austrian red wines, Kat, in the UK.
I think for me, based very much on my kind of career to date and my experience, which is sort of mass market retail, a lot broader as a consumer base, certainly than the Wine Society. And this might sound controversial, I actually don't think there is currently an image for Austrian red wine within that consumer base. There's simply at the moment not enough Austrian red wine out there for it to make an impression on the average wine drinker. That means it's challenging, I guess, from a sales perspective, but if you flip that over, it's a massive opportunity because there's a blank slate, there's no real preconceptions as to what an Austrian red wine should taste like. So it is a real opportunity to attack a market and kind of present something in a very coherent way so that you get a kind of consistency coming through in the wines that consumer experiences. And I think from my perspective, it's about ensuring that unique kind of freshness, crunchiness, that almost Beaujolais style of kind of fruity, delicious wines, that's really where Austria can make a mark. But it's not there yet in terms of that mass market sector.
It's work to be done.
I agree. There's a Beaujolais-shaped hole in the market because it just fits very neatly into that slot with a delicate light chill. Megan?
Yeah, so I mean, for us, because we sell predominantly to the on-trade, there does seem to be, it's still relatively small, but a bit of a growing demand for Austrian reds, and particularly with those styles of wines. So like you were saying, Freddie, about they could be chilled down, they're very accessible, and those styles are definitely gaining traction in the on-trade, particularly in London. So I think there's a real opportunity for them, and like I said, it's still small, and I think awareness is still pretty small as well. But then that's where we need to come in and do that job of communicating about these styles of wines and where the opportunities lie with them.
I agree with Megan. Perhaps with a bit of more awareness, something can be done. Perhaps with more education, especially within the sommelier in the UK. Perhaps activating some important by the glass program. The wines can be spread a little bit more than only by the bottle.
So, Matteo, where are the biggest competitors for Austrian reds?
Perhaps we were discussing like yesterday with the Loire red wines, Burgundy, of course, especially with the low quantity and price rising can be definitely there.
Julia?
I think I agree with you in terms of looking at the lighter style, the fresher styles, and the price of Pinot being so high. Why can't you use some of the Saint Laurent or Zweigelt to fit that? What we're drinking in UK today is a lot of Malbec, Can Austria take a little share of the market with those lovely juicy fruits, with beautiful underpinning freshness? Yes, it can. So I think it's someone mentioned Beaujolais earlier on. There's a lot of different gaps that Austrian wines can go and take, depending on the variety, depending on the style. So it's quite open to my mind.
One thing I think that we have to be a little bit conscious of is a potential slight disconnect between where we in the UK see Austrian wines slotting in terms of how you would compare them stylistically to other wines. Mm-hmm. Because I think we still see within Austria and a lot of the winemakers, specifically in Burgenland, actually a comparison between their wines and Bordeaux more than actually any of the regions that we've probably just mentioned. Mm-hmm. And that's a very, very difficult region to take on in the UK market. Yeah. And something that I think it's really important that winemakers are conscious of. Yes. Because we've been talking a lot about these light, crunchy, chillable red wines, and that is a sector of the market which seems to be growing in popularity in the UK and is probably easier to get into. But it does take a consistent approach from a lot of the wineries, I think, to make sure that actually they, across the board, come together to make a style of wine that then is understandable and is crucially not aimed at trying to take on a region like Bordeaux, because Bordeaux and the UK have such a long history.
I think that's also I think it's a really interesting point there around kind of consumer mindset and expectation, because the consumer who is buying Bordeaux is very traditional, quite set in their ways, and they're not really open to experimentation. Yeah. So if you're aiming as a winemaker who's making Zweigelt or kind of Austrian red wines to tackle the consumer who is wedded very firmly to Bordeaux, you're going to have a really tough time putting an alternative into their hands. Whereas actually, if you are going after the customer who's looking for something bright, light, crunchy, Beaujolais focused, maybe drinks a bit of Pais from Chile, some Sanso from South Africa, they are consumers who are more open-minded naturally, more experimental, more willing to try new things, and it's a bit more of an open door. And you're going to face less resistance talking to those customers than you are those very traditional Bordeaux drinkers.
I think there's also an opportunity with different ages of drinkers in the UK as well, because I think we're seeing perhaps that it's often the younger drinkers who are now coming through, who are at a point where they've got some disposable income to spend on wine. They're getting interested and are probably more likely to be into those lighter, juicier styles of wines than perhaps really traditional Bordeaux. So it's kind of bringing the wines in at the bottom and seeing them kind of rise up as those drinkers become more experienced and more engaged. If we can get them early with Austrian red wines, then
and you look at kind of the latest insight patterns in terms of generational behaviours. Absolutely, it's millennials and Gen Z who are open to unusual indigenous grape varieties. So they really are the subset of customers in the UK to talk to, because they are naturally interested in what Austria is doing because it's different.
It is different. That's one thing people. Nothing wrong with Cabernet and Merlot and Malbec or anything else, but people are the younger generation. They are looking for something that's slightly different, and as long as there is value for money, I think that's the door. And value for money, I'm not talking about entry level or cheap one. I'm talking about you can have a value for money wines for 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds. Over 20 years ago, I used to sell top-end Austrian wines to Michelin-star restaurants in London. But it was expensive at the time. It's still expensive today, but it's still good value when you compare with an amazing Burgundy and so on. So, okay, you can have a Burgundy for that price, but look at what Austria can do. And it happened to be a Pinot. Yeah. But it was amazing. So as long as there is value for money, at any level, I think that's a
and Megan, you mentioned the London market earlier, and that London is 10 million people or whatever, a country in its own right almost. It's that's a great sort of potential spot for Austrian reds, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the things that you can really see is that trends often start in London as well, and then they filter out. So when you're looking for something that's maybe a bit more interesting or different, and that's where Austria's got this really good opportunity with their indigenous varieties and things like Blaufränkisch or Zweigelt, rather than focusing maybe on some of the more international varieties that people perhaps have got, not necessarily bored of, but they're used to, and they want to be challenged and they want to find something new. And so, in London, particularly in the on-trade, that's where we do have a good opportunity to then introduce these, and then it will have that filter out effect as it becomes more well known and more popular as well.
And Matteo, I think you're bang on Saint Laurent as well. I think it's increasingly depressing trying to buy Burgundy.
Yeah.
Hello, Saint Laurent.
Yeah. Cheers.
So, Kat, what's the message for producers trying to get their wines into the UK market? What should they do and not do?
Yeah. These are both quite big questions, but I'll try and keep my thoughts succinct. So I think actually, Freddie, you came back with a really good point about the pride in the varietal. And ultimately, there's pretty much no one else around the world making Zweigelt, Saint Laurent, and Blaufränkisch. So be really proud of what you're doing. Understand that is your absolute unique selling point. Go for it, and don't take any kind of detraction from what you're actually producing, because the fact that you're doing something so different from unique varieties, that is why you deserve a space in the market. So that is how you carve out your niche. I guess in terms of what not to do, I think it's about, again, sort of not straying too far from that sort of purity of kind of fruit expression, and understanding that there are definitely spaces in the UK market for wines that are just deliciously fruity, pure, crunchy, fresh. You don't have to overwhelm everything with oak in order to find a consumer. And actually there are spaces for lots of different wine styles. So I think it's kind of keeping true to the varietal, to the fact that this is Austrian, and really just kind of consolidating all your efforts on that.
Yeah. Be proud of what you're doing. Yeah. And what I said earlier, offer value for money at every step of the way.
Yeah. That's really important. I think one thing which is an interesting conversation to have on this is ultimately one of Austria's great strengths, and it definitely applies to the reds, is the variety on offer. And that's sort of a blessing and a curse in a way. It's sometimes easier to hammer home a message when it's a very simple message, the elevator pitch. If you can sum something up in 2 sentences, it's easier to break through into a very noisy market. And that's what Austria does very well with Gruner in particular, with the whites, but with the reds, where you've got those 3 main varieties that we've been talking about really, and actually a plethora of different styles that people are making, right from your really juicy sort of unoaked Zweigelt, for example, up to your really sort of grand classic Bordeaux-esque varieties, and then of course your international varieties as well, which people are often blending into these wines. Just have a think about what's the message. What are you trying to get across here? The more people that can sort of together as a group promote a particular style, and sounds like from our conversation that we all believe that those lovely, crunchy, vibrant styles are the ones that probably have the most potential to break through. So it's just really important that people come together as a group and really kind of, I think, tell that story. Because then it's much easier for the consumer to stop, listen, understand, and keep it really, really simple. Never forget that it's a very, very busy wine market out there.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I think you mentioned about the USP. Okay, so you know your USP, what Austrian in general, in terms of red wines, what they are. But then amongst that group, as a producer, as yourself, what is your storytelling? What are you different? And I think the art of storytelling, is it your vineyard, is it your family, something that stands you apart, your elevator pitch. And I think that sometimes you pick some information from producers. I think that it lacks a little bit of that engaging with the consumer with emotion.
And the very high number of family producers really makes that story much easier to tell, doesn't it? What's the best way onto restaurant lists?
Again, I mean, I agree with what you just said. Probably to focus on indigenous varieties rather than go with international varieties, that the market is already full of it. And there are already plenty of newer countries that are focusing on international varieties. So,
and Megan?
Well, yeah, I mean, broadly similar, and it is about having that kind of story to tell as well. And whether it's your family run or whether you're sustainable initiatives or things like that, or organic. And I know we were talking yesterday about the high proportion of sustainable and organics that are in Austria, and it's really quite something to shout about. And I think it's not something that people know that much about. So communication really is key, because then it helps it to bring in to me as the importer, to then maybe sell on to a restaurant and ultimately to the end consumer as well. So I think that's the opportunity really.
Sparkling wines today, we know that Austrian can make some delicious sparkling wine. Today we only have a very small selection, and based on that, it's quite hard to pass judgment. I tasted 2, which I thought I'll be very happy to share with my friends, but I think Austria can do better, and sadly we didn't see the critical mass to be able to speak more about sparkling wine in Austria.
In your opinion, Junior, which are the grape varieties that produce the best sparkling wine in Austria? Because there are all sorts of different grape varieties that are used. We see Chardonnay quite a bit, but then we see Welsh Riesling and various other bits and bobs. Where's the quality, do you think?
The best wines I've tasted from Austria have been champagne based sparkling wines, so Pinot and Chardonnay mainly.
So because the public, I guess, is not ready to different expression of different varieties, they all stick with the Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and then perhaps Pinot Blanc. So
there are some delicious Muscat, which is more informal, fruit forward, easy to drink. But sadly, we haven't seen those slightly less, more fun wines, but we haven't seen it.
So sweet wines, we had a few, and I think some golds in the mix as well, Junior.
I think in terms of styles, we expect in most competitions, sweet wines, they shine. And we know Austrian is does particularly well on that. It's wonderful climate, the humidity from the lake, especially in this area. So the sweet wines today, they were very, very high standard with a lot of golds. So very, very positive.
Yeah, we had some lovely examples on our panel, didn't we?
We certainly did. So we tasted 7 sweet wines. But within that, we awarded 1 gold and 2 silvers, which in terms of ratios, as a judge, that's really good to see. The wines that really excelled, the first one was a Welsh Riesling, delicious, very complex, loads of really lovely kind of botrytised flavours, but perfectly balanced. And then the other one that did really well as well was a Gruner Veltliner, but in ice wine style. So it was really nice to see that spread of different grape varieties and styles performing really strongly. And we certainly, as a panel, felt that the sweet wines of Austria deserve more of an audience. There's so much potential there.
You were impressed, Freddie?
I was impressed. Yeah. So similarly, we had 2 golds in our small flight of 6 sweet wines, which is phenomenal, wonderful. Really. And I think one of the crucial things, again, which we always talk about with Austria, but is the acidity. They're so crisp, they're so fresh, it balances the sugar really, really nicely. So you get all of this sort of opulence and this incredibly generous style of wine, but ultimately you're left wanting another sip of it because it's so crisp and clean. And I think that's such a strength that Austria's got with its sweet wines.
It's a shame as professionals or as consumers, we don't consume more sweet wines. But what we tasted today, one thing Austria is the botrytis, but it's the purity of the fruit. It's really pure, and they're delicious wines, as you said, with lovely freshness.
One of the challenges, of course, with sweet wine is trying to get it into the UK market in particular, where we have such a historic Sauterne market, and it's a shame, because if we can try and convince people to sort of broaden their horizons a little bit to some of these Austrian sweet wines, then they deliver so much drinking pleasure, whether for a dessert or an aperitif even.